Hi, everyone. Hi. Wow. Okay. So we didn't lose too much of the crowd after Dan's talk, which is good. I assume the rest of you here are very interested in the topic du jour, which is of this panel anyway, which will address some of the issues surrounding capacity building, specifically in the South China Sea. So I spent most of my Army career kind of doing capacity building in one way or another. And frankly, I can tell you that I encountered few successes, and those successes were always very hard won. And I suppose that one of the benefits of now being retired and kind of sitting on the podium at a think tank is now that I can just simply talk and make recommendations about capacity building and then leave the execution to others. So I'm going to take full advantage of that and pepper you with recommendations and the recommendations of my esteemed panelists here. And we'll leave it to our counterparts at the Pentagon and at the State Department and our allies and partners to execute these recommendations. So I'm going to start by making a few scene setter points before turning it over to the panelists. There are only three, and I'll try to be brief. So the first is simply to consider the assumptions that accompany a discussion about capacity building, security capacity building in the South China Sea, more specifically. Just the fact that it's on this agenda today, I think, reveals some of the assumptions. CSIS has recognized or seems to have made the assumption that there are capability shortfalls in the region that must be addressed because they pose security risks. Hence, it's on the agenda as a topic. There are several other, and I'm not going to be checking my email here, it's just that I put my notes on my iPhone, so indulge me for a moment. Some of these, I'm just going to rattle off a few assumptions. I'm not going to fully explore them. In fact, Dan touched on a few of them in his remarks just a moment ago, but I'm just going to throw them out there just to kind of provoke some thinking. So, among the assumptions I think that we just accept without challenging are that weak regional militaries are exploited by opportunistic expansionist powers. Number two, regional militaries' inability to monitor their territorial waters enables China or other powers to undertake expansionist activity unchallenged. Thirdly, that improved maritime domain awareness capability will somehow deter all of this activity. Fourthly, improved lethality of regional militaries will also have some type of deterrent effect. So, again, I just throw those out there without expanding on them, but there are some obvious questions whether any of these assumptions should pass unchallenged. I think most of us who have spent any time in the policy or in the military world, have been trained to be wary of untested assumptions because they lead to perverse policy outcomes. And so I think that definitely pertains here. Okay, my second point as a scene setter, that apart from all the hardware and technological weaponry, sensors, boats, ships, planes, apart from all of that, the single most important capability shortfall in the region is the underdeveloped ability for regional partners to act in concert with one another. There have been some strides made, some progress made in the area of multilateral security cooperation. But in my view, investments made in that area to kind of strengthen the normative basis of multilateral security cooperation are probably the most important investments that can be made. And again, that speaks to less about the technology interoperability, but rather things like forging relationships, building trust, moving in a direction that enables partners to recognize their shared interests and act upon them. My last scene setter point is that given U.S. given the shortfall of U.S. resources and the large capability gaps that should be addressed in the region, there is clearly a need for more synchronized effort with like-minded partners, including, of course, Australia and Japan. And ultimately, I would argue, China, I think, will need to be part of any lasting multilateral security architecture that will take place in Asia. Currently, China is kind of sniffing around the edges and does some of its own multilateral security cooperation, but it remains apart from the bulk of what's happening out there, which is indeed U.S.-led. But I don't think that's sustainable going forward. I think at some point China needs to kind of become part of that fabric. But in the near term, things like the Maritime Security Initiative, even though $450 million seems like a lot of money, spread over 5 years, and in recognition of the fact that aircraft and sensors, radars, intel fusion centers, the things that Dan talked about, those are all extraordinarily expensive. So you're talking about spreading some peanut butter pretty thinly over that piece of toast. So anyway, those are the 3 points I'd like to make as a scene setter, and I hope that'll help shape some of the comments of the panelists to come. So.
Thank you, Desmond, and thank you, organizers of the CSIS conference, for inviting me. In my time allotted, I would like to try to cover 3 topics. First, I want to spend a few minutes reviewing some of the military modernization developments that I think are of high relevance to the South China Sea. Second, I would like to spend some time talking about how the Chinese might use this military power to further their strategic goals in the South China Sea. And then third, I'll conclude with some observations. So regarding military modernization, it's important to have a little bit of context. The Maritime region is clearly an important driver of China's military modernization. Chinese official documents and military writings emphasize the importance of the maritime domain as a source of threat. The 2015 Defense White Paper, for example, stated that preparations for military struggles now, quote, highlight, end quote, the maritime domain as an area of military struggle. Similarly, the Science of Military Strategy, published by the Academy of Military Science in 2013, stated that the, quote, most likely threat facing China concerned a limited military conflict in the maritime direction, end quote. So the maritime direction obviously includes the East China Sea and Taiwan, but the South China Sea is an important component of that maritime domain as well. So if the South China Sea is very much on the mind of Chinese defense planners and leaders, what capabilities is the PLA developing that could be applied to this theater? Obviously, time doesn't allow me to cover the breadth and variety of capabilities that the Chinese are fielding. So I would just like to take a few minutes to touch on a small number of systems that I think are useful for painting a picture of the evolution of the PLA and its capabilities in the South China Sea. There are many more capabilities I will not mention. I invite discussion during Q&A, but just forewarning, I'm only going to touch on a few. So I'm going to touch on some developments in command structure, maritime domain, air, and amphibious assault. In terms of command, the reorganization of the PLA, a set of reforms that was announced early this year, envisions the development of a 5-theater command system. The southern theater, which should be based in Guangzhou, will likely manage the South China Sea. The significance of this is, should the reforms carry through successfully, the Chinese military could be in a better position to coordinate and plan operations in the South China Sea more effectively than they can today. In terms of military forces, the development of capabilities related to the PLA Navy, Chinese Coast Guard, and what many call the Maritime militia are directly relevant to the South China Sea. The buildup of maritime forces has been impressive. As of 2015, according to a report by the Office of Navy Intelligence, South China's fleet featured 2 attack nuclear submarines, 4 nuclear ballistic missile submarines, 16 diesel attack submarines, 9 destroyers, 20 frigates, 25 amphibious ships, 38 missile patrol craft, and 8 corvettes. To drill down just a little bit on some of these vessels, the Luoyang 3 DDG is an example of some very advanced capabilities that the PLA Navy is fielding. It carries HHQ-9 SAM with a range of about 80 nautical miles, as well as the YJ-62 anti-ship missile, which some reports say could possibly reach out to 250 nautical miles. The Liaoning aircraft carrier could be very useful in the South China Sea. It can carry 36 fixed and rotary wing aircraft and could supplement the air protection capability that the tiny artificial islands currently are expected to bear. China also has 4 Yuzhou LPD amphibious ships. These could be extremely useful in many peacetime and conflict missions. They could be used to assist with humanitarian aid and disasters, and it can also carry, each one can carry about a battalion of Marines and 15 to 20 amphibious assault vehicles. Submarines, China has developed some very impressive submarine capabilities. There are 4 Jin nuclear ballistic missile submarines likely to operate, or in fact, they are operating out of the Yalong base off Hainan Island, and probably will operate as in a bastion type capacity in the South China Sea. Chinese Coast Guard, just touch on some developments there. The CCG has seen a huge expansion in its capability. Maritime law enforcement forces have added over 100 vessels over the past decade, and recently the Chinese Coast Guard added a 12,000-ton cutter, the largest in the world. Maritime militia consists of fishermen who serve in a part-time capacity to help support law enforcement operations. They receive training and some equipment. We don't know the exact size of the maritime militia, but China does have over 200,000 fishing vessels, though, again, we're not sure how many of those are actually involved. Air, PLA Navy has added capable multi-role aircraft capable of both air superiority and strike missions, such as the Sukhoi 30 and indigenous J-10 and J-11 variant aircraft. It also has H-6 bombers with ASCM capability. And then just briefly on amphibious forces, the PLA Navy has 2 brigades, about 5,000 to 6,000 troops each of Marines stationed in Southern Theater. These could be used for a variety of contingencies. So, very brief rundown of some important developments. How can these be used in the South China Sea? Well, China, in my view, has 2 competing objectives that are in tension with each other. On the one hand, the Chinese want to consolidate their control over disputed features and over the waters of the South China Sea. But on the other hand, they want stability and they want to avoid a war. In the words of Xi Jinping, the goals of the military in this area and the maritime domain writ large is to balance protection of rights on one hand with the protection of stability on the other. This suggests that the most likely use of these assets will be in a peacetime capacity and possibly in a crisis, but that the Chinese are still going to try to continue to avoid a war. For peacetime, the assets can be used in a both carrot and stick approach. The carrot or incentive that the PLA could offer is to work with other militaries in the region to address shared concerns and threats, to Desmond's point earlier. The PLA Air Force has aircraft such as the IL-76 and coming online, the Y-20, which could help ferry equipment to natural disasters and assist with humanitarian relief. The PLA Navy's LPDs can also be useful in this capacity. The increased Chinese Coast Guard and Maritime Patrol aircraft could help with search and rescue. However, beneath this velvet glove of a promise of win-win security cooperation lies the mailed fist of the military's combat capabilities. This is the stick, which threatens to raise extremely high costs on countries that challenge Chinese control of features in the South China Sea. Due to the unavoidable reality that greater Chinese control of contested features must come at the expense of whoever China is contesting with, the risk of a militarized crisis cannot be avoided. The maritime patrol aircraft and the fielding of a lot of Coast Guard vessels in the South China Sea and the Spratlys gives China the ability to respond quickly. And then in conflict, I'll just mention that China, again, tends to avoid conflict for now, but the growing array of ships, airplanes, and other capabilities allows China options in the event of an escalation. In conclusion, China is rapidly modernizing military, is expanding the range of options available to its decision makers. China clearly prefers peacetime employment of incentives and coercive efforts and is hoping to avoid conflict. However, there are limits to what the military power can do. China has vulnerabilities in peacetime, in crisis, and in conflict. In peacetime, its efforts to incentivize cooperation arguably have not been extremely successful. One indicator of that is this great turnout and the discussion that suggests the real limits to Chinese efforts to win people over. And in crisis, the growing involvement of the U.S., Japan, and other powerful actors raises the risk of miscalculation, so Chinese must be very careful how they operate in a crisis. And then in a conflict, the sheer challenges of the geography pose serious operational obstacles for Chinese forces that must operate at vast distances far from their mainland. And this will continue to be a challenge for any operation that's larger than a very, very minor skirmish. So pending your questions, that concludes my discussion.
Thank you for sharing those insights, Tim. I'm going to now turn it over to Natalie Sambi, who I think is going to focus on the Jokowi administration's efforts to build Indonesia's maritime security capacity.
Thanks, Des. Thanks, everyone at CSIS, for inviting me to be at this conference. I'll start a little bit by giving an overview of some of the main elements of the Global Maritime Fulcrum vision under President Jokowi, grapple with some of the challenges, and talk a little bit about some of the opportunities therein. So in October 2014, President Joko Widodo unveiled his vision at the Global Maritime Fulcrum for Indonesia to reimagine itself as a maritime country. And a key element of that was about boosting maritime defenses. To be clear, that does respond to China, but it is not necessarily about China. And to this end, one of Jokowi's key initiatives was not only to bolster the Coast Guard, but also to continue the naval and air force upgrades as part of the military modernization plan known as the Minimum Essential Force that was started under President Yudhoyono. So along with Jokowi's emphasis on all things maritime and his reputation to be tough on illegal fishing, we had almost 2 years of a strong association between Jokowi and what we hoped to be a flexing of Indonesia's maritime bicep. And we, the international community, have cheered it on the sidelines. But as the last 2 years have shown, the picture is a lot more complicated. The modernization has been a little bit patchier, and I'll grapple with some of those challenges now. One of the ones I want to start with is the policy context that President Jokowi has been operating in. Yes, the Global Maritime Fulcrum is meant to push the military modernization plans forward, but Indonesia's Defense White Paper has also been recently released. What I would like to highlight in that paper is that not only does it make the usual noises about global security threats, but it is ultimately focused on internal defense, making statements about radicalization, preventing proxy wars that are waged through communists and gays. One of the realities with Indonesia, as this defense document demonstrates, is that there is still a strong army-centric culture in the defense establishment, irrespective of what the president's will is. In fact, the Defense White Paper makes no mention of the Global Maritime Fulcrum at all, which is astounding given the centrality of that vision to Jokowi's presidency. It's clear that the Ministry of Defense's priorities lie elsewhere. And so one question raised by this document in and of itself is how will Indonesia's competing elements of its defense bureaucracy resolve this, and how far will the Global Maritime Fulcrum be realized? And that's just at the policy level. So let's look a little bit now at what's transpired in the upgrades in the naval and Coast Guard realm. So let's just talk at the naval level for the moment, where Indonesia plans to develop a green water force to effectively police its EEZ and also undertake limited regional activities. So according to the 2008 Minimum Essential Force Plan, the Navy requires 274 vessels, 137 aircraft, Other supporting platforms, forces, replenishment systems, all to be developed by 2024. Good luck. So I'm going to just talk about submarines to give an example. Obviously, we're limited by time today, to give you an indication about how Indonesia is grappling with these modernization plans. So Indonesia currently has 2 submarines, and given its location at strategic choke points and its expansive archipelago, you can say it desperately needs more than that, and it set itself a target of 12. But it's been a rather winding road. So some years ago, the Russians offered Indonesia second-hand Kilo-class submarines, to which Indonesia originally said, no thank you, but has come around to say, oh maybe. And it's also been courting France, and it's been looking at Scorpene submarines. But it is also cooperating with South Korea to build 3 Changbogo subs by 2020, and intends to actually boost its local defense industry by building the 4th onwards in Indonesia itself in Surabaya. It's a challenge, I think, in and of itself. Now, Indonesia's minimum essential force plans don't allow for slippage, so it will be interesting to see whether or not Indonesia can stick to these timelines. And as I mentioned earlier, Indonesia's 180 decision to reconsider Russian Kilo submarines, by one analyst's estimates, is about the delay with South Korea, so there are a few dark clouds on the horizon there. I would be actually also interested to see how Indonesia is going to manage a submarine force from multiple source countries, and whether or not those submarines from South Korea are delivered on time. So given that submarines are a priority platform, it's currently suffering from what I call institutional dithering, and will certainly be plagued by organizational challenges as it is managed through its life cycle. Let's go to the Coast Guard. So the story of the Coast Guard, or the Maritime Security Board, known by its acronym BAKAMLA, is similarly mixed. It was upgraded from a coordinating body in 2014, but questions remain about its official legal status. In operational terms, there are serious overlaps between not only the Indonesian Coast Guard, but other agencies as well. The Navy, the National Police, Maritime Affairs and Fisheries Ministry, Transport Ministry, and Finance Ministry at certain levels also conduct Coast Guard tasks, and these overlaps have not been thus resolved. I would like to point out that all 3 confrontations between Indonesian authorities and illegal Chinese fishermen around the Natuna Islands have involved the Indonesian Navy, which has opened fire on at least 2 of those occasions. Unlike states like Vietnam with the more established Coast Guard, Indonesia lacks a civilian option as the first responder, so it robs itself of a de-escalatory option by sending the Navy first. The Ministry for Maritime Affairs and Fishery also runs a Task Force 115, whose central role is to eradicate illegal fishing. The Minister, Susi Pujiastuti, who many of you might know as a very strident businesswoman running that portfolio and as an all-round badass, is the commander of Task Force 115. However, the force also comprises officers from the Ministry, National Police and Navy, but notably none from BAKAMLA. Why not? BAKAMLA is also still mired in capability shortages. Yes, it was given 3 indigenous ships in October, but not nearly enough for patrolling Indonesia's archipelago. The Navy is meant to transfer 10 ships to BAKAMLA, but both forces remain seriously under strength. So with all this in mind, what are the opportunities? So, as we know recently, Indonesia has had several confrontations with China around the Natuna Islands. Jokowi has continued Indonesia's long-standing principle of non-alignment, and it would be interesting to see whether or not these confrontations start to shift Indonesia to encouraging it to, or rather, cooperating more with the United States and other partners. And there are some areas that are ripe for opportunity and cooperation as well. As I mentioned, capability is an issue for Indonesia. The Indonesian government does want to boost its local defense industry and is obviously sourcing from a number of different countries. But areas such as surveillance and radar capacity for maritime domain awareness are certainly a priority as well. The second area I would like to highlight, which I think is arguably more important than just capability in order to boost Indonesia's maritime capabilities, is actually more about governance, processes, and if you like, the software behind boosting Indonesia's maritime ops. I think those areas which will help Indonesia become more effective. And in that space, the United States, Australia, Japan, India, and Singapore have a competitive edge relative to China to provide that kind of training. And I'm thinking about providing working groups for the Indonesian Coast Guard to help clarify their requirements and their roles so that they may make a stronger case to their Indonesian government about their jurisdiction. That could be conducted under the US's Maritime Security Initiative, but also to expand governance issues under the Defense Institution Reform Initiative. Oops, I just lost my page. But all in all, I'll end with 3 conclusions. As far as JCOI's Global Maritime Fulcrum Vision has been concerned, there's been some progress in military modernization, but it still faces significant cultural, bureaucratic, and budgetary challenges. There have been some positive developments, but they tend to be driven by crises, like some of the budgetary allocations that have given around the time of the Natuna crises, rather than long-term planning, and perhaps we can address that more in the Q&A. The second point to make is that it's important to remember that Indonesia's naval and Coast Guard upgrades do respond and can respond to some of the pressures in the South China Sea, but they are dedicated to meeting the wide array of traditional and non-traditional challenges that Indonesia meets in the maritime domain. The good news is that some of these issues, like piracy and maritime terrorism, are able to drive cooperation between ASEAN states and should be encouraged. And lastly, any assistance offered to Indonesia in the governance space, as I mentioned earlier, or in capability, perhaps should focus more on the institutional building and expand current initiatives under the Maritime Security Initiative and Defence Institution Reform Initiative. We still have 3 more years of JCOI's presidency, so I wouldn't give up yet on the Global Maritime Fulcrum, but I'd be interested to see what comes up over the horizon. Thank you.
Thank you, Natalie. Fascinating comments. And if I may, the 2 points that you made about the legacy Army-centric view on security force kind of resourcing, I mean, that's a regional issue that prevails, I think, throughout Southeast Asia and has significant impacts on underfunding naval and air forces as a consequence. And then the second point you made about illustrating Indonesia's submarine modernization effort, kind of a hodgepodge approach, 3 partners. I mean, that also, I think, illustrates much of the approach towards military acquisition and modernization in the region with predictable consequences on training and readiness. Very complicated at best. Now I'd like to invite Professor Emeritus Carl Thayer for his remarks.
Thank you. If the system works, that's not the... There we go. I'd like to thank CSIS for the invitation to speak today. I have a 5-part presentation, a little bit of a background, regional defense expenditure to put it in context, looking at force modernization and capacity building, first in the Philippines and Vietnam, and ending with U.S. security. The background would be that both in the 1990s began to come up with force modernization programs overwhelmingly related to South China Sea contingencies. The 1995 Armed Forces of the Philippines Modernization Act followed the occupation of Mischief Reef. And in Vietnam, after normalizing relations with China, saw in 1992 China's passage of a law on territorial sea and contiguous zones which laid claim to the Parasols and Spratly Islands, and Vietnam had garrisoned extensively in the Spratly Islands. But also in 94, 96, there were problems of oil exploration, particularly when China gave the Crestone Energy Corporation an oil rig, and there were confrontations involving Vietnamese military ships against Chinese supply ships. When the shoe was on the other foot, and Vietnam was in a more advantageous position. So there's argy-bargy then there. The Vietnamese modernization program, unlike the Philippines' first program fizzled completely, and it wasn't until Aquino came that the Modernization Act was revived, aiming at minimum deterrence and moving from internal security to territorial defense, whereas Vietnam has pursued a gradual naval and air modernization and taking its coastal and inland fleet and making it a green water one able to operate in the South China Sea. Just to put all this in perspective, that there are 3 indicators, metrics, if you will, of defense spending. One is a proportion of GDP. We see that Vietnam's has come way down to just around 2%. But then there's economic growth in that country, gives more of the pie to share on defense, where the Philippines has languished at pretty much at 1% over in recent years. If we look at the defense spending as a proportion of government spending itself, Vietnam is under 10, around 8% of government spending. It too has come down and bottomed out a little bit, and the Philippines is under 5% compared to the other states, and Singapore's up on top. These charts show the main ASEAN militaries. If we look at the Southeast Asian defense budget in terms of US dollars, Vietnam hits about $4 billion, and the Philippines around $2 billion plus. So we have that broad regional picture. Force modernization in the Philippines itself, on the Navy side, has been to acquire 2, and in the future 3 Hamilton-class cutters, commissioning them into the Philippine Navy. They're good ocean patrol vessels of a certain vintage. Australia has donated, what I should also say is all the equipment the Philippines is getting is used. So they're getting 5 Balikpapan class landing craft heavy from Australia, which has donated them to them and paid off, and South Korea has donated 1 Pohang class corvette. So coming from a Navy that was looking at the U.S. prior to 1991 to do the maritime domain, they've had to build up themselves. The Air Force modernization, really in the bottom right-hand side, is they've got 2 of 12 South Korean lead-in fighter trainers for their Air Force. That's a new development because they had paid off their airstrike capability over a decade ago, or nearly that. But the acquisition of lots of utility, transport, and attack helicopters is a new thing that could flit around the island archipelago, and with these other ships that I talked about, the landing craft heavy, begin to deploy in the archipelago, but not really effective against dealing with the might of China in the area. Contrast that with Vietnam. Its determined program saw the acquisition of all the platforms I'm talking about are armed with very effective missiles, anti-ship, cruise missiles, anti-air. So the Svetklak, basically a patrol craft close to the coast, fast-track missile craft. The Molniya, a corvette, a light ship, again, its equipment. The Gepard guided missile frigates are the mainstay. They put off buying Sigmas from the Netherlands. A high-altitude air defense system, which is important because if you're putting all your subs in Cam Ranh Bay, you need to be able to protect that in Hanoi and whatnot. And that's the Su-30 system is very effective itself. In the air, initially the Su-27s, they went out of production, getting up to 36 Su-37s, again, equipped for strike maritime, and they do patrols over the South China Sea. And then the Bastion, a highly mobile coastal missile system that can move up and down and pretty well target ships in Vietnam's exclusive economic zone. So it gives it a bit of a deterrence there. And then the Israeli extended range artillery itself, again, useful. But the crown and the jewel is the acquisition of 5 of 6 Varshavyanka, or enhanced Kilo submarines. Those torpedo tubes that you see can lay mines, fire heavy torpedo, fire cruise missiles, and in recent acquisition, land attack cruise missiles that Vietnam has acquired. And they're beginning their patrols without their Soviet advisors, and all the instructions is in Russian. All that has then put Vietnam in the time period 2011 to 2015 is among the world's 8th largest importer of weapons. And Russia, unsurprisingly, is the main provider. The Ukraine, that's fading over time because of its own problems, and tiny Spain for the maritime patrol craft. On the agenda, but not confined, is the BrahMos, the Brahman-Moscow joint venture missile that India is now testing and acquiring for surface, land, air, and undersea. It's too big for the Gepards. They'd have to order a new set to actually fit them, so it's unclear which ones the Vietnamese want. Pretty devastating and very, very effective. That brings me to U.S. maritime security assistance, and I echo Desmond, the $425 million over 5 years. Of the 40-odd million for this fiscal year, 85% roughly is going to the Philippines, and everybody else gets the small change from that. So the Philippines is the largest recipient in the region of American security assistance. It's mainly for training and logistical basis to build up the infrastructure for the Navy and the Coast Guard, the ability for the Armed Forces, Air Force to conduct maritime operations, then at the lower end, naval maintenance, fleet upgrades, interdiction vessels, communication, aircraft procurement, and then under the excess article, defense articles, acquiring that 3rd cutter from the United States. And then for the Maritime Security Initiative towards Vietnam, program there under 20 million, maritime intelligence, surveillance and reconnaissance platforms. The program has seen a slight increase in assistance, and then the work in progress is the lifting of the arms restrictions on Vietnam. And General Nguyen Chi Binh at the Shangri-La Dialogue in an interview stated they had no immediate plans to purchase, and because it was a new decision, it was one made suddenly and without particular warning, advance notice to Vietnam. So the last slide, sums up with those 2 arrows where the Philippines is on the list of money and where Vietnam is at the bottom. And I would end, because I had a career refereeing soccer, Vietnam is military is a soccer team that has barely got to play as a team on the field, and it doesn't play in anybody else's league. And that's to get on to Des's point that it really needs to do that. They do coordinated patrols. They do them with China, and they do port visits. Those are new step-ups. They do it with the Philippines, Cambodia. They've begun port visits, so they cross the line. I thought that was an interesting expression, except when you're in Singapore, you cross the line every day, the equator for mariners type things. So they're doing port visits, and they're beginning to contribute with hospital ships to the ASEAN Defense Ministers Plus exercises. So they're pushing strongly defense cooperation and quietly in ASEAN, but they know it won't work to try to step up the level of exercises. Thank you.
Thank you, Carl. With all of the insights that you gained by researching Philippines' modernization efforts, it just strikes me that a woefully under-resourced defense establishment is yet still striving to maintain the traditional structure of a military with the Navy and the Air Force and the Army. Are you detecting anyone thinking kind of asymmetrically, thinking creatively about how to apply limited resources in asymmetric ways that would obviate the need to invest in all of the traditional infrastructure? So, for example, replacing airplanes with UAVs, replacing large ships with smaller craft, perhaps armed or not armed, but in kind of like a swarm method that our Iranian friends sometimes employ in the Persian Gulf, which is quite effective and probably a heck of a lot cheaper than fielding a big Navy.
Well, I'm not a thorough expert, but I have one source that says that given all that I've described, the Philippines does not possess missiles. It hasn't moved to even that stage yet. I think later it's armed helicopters. If they're going to do anti-submarine warfare, may have to change their configuration, and so the jets that they got will fire bullets, but but not so that. Yeah, no, I don't see that. I think at the moment the attention till Duterte gets communist in his cabinet, which he's done, and gets the peace settlement signed in the South, there's still that concern that internal security could bubble up. And just getting around the island archipelago at the start of all this with Mr. Freefield, they wanted to keep 3 Coast Guard vessels around the entire archipelago. We're focused on the South China Sea. Hello, folks. There's this other coast that comes around, and Australian pilots that fly over say there's a deep water trench, and you can see all the foreign illegal fishing boats. My God, you don't want people to have maritime domain awareness. They might want to enforce it then if they knew what was going on out there. So I don't think the Philippines has got that way, and they're not. I think Vietnam is the one that's more robust, configuring to be able to fire back if they're fired on. And they're not in here, but in the future, going from Belarusian manufactured drones to try to get much bigger and robust ones to patrol and have strike capabilities. But I don't think the Philippines is in that ballgame.
Thank you. Thank you, Carl. I'd now like to turn the floor to Tetsuo Kotani, who's a senior fellow at the Japanese Institute of International Affairs.
Thank you. And let me thank the CSIS for the invitation. The capacity building is a relatively less provocative topic, but it's a very long day for all of us. So let me a little bit provocative in this topic. So let me begin with the assessment of the current militarization in the South China Sea, and then the future direction of the regional capacity building programs. Despite its public pledge not to militarize the South China Sea, China has been making every effort to turn the international waterway into a Chinese Caribbean. And China has developed a 3,000-meter airstrip in the Woody Island, and they have deployed the anti-ship and anti-missile capabilities with radar and fighter jet aircraft. And perhaps we will see the same development in the Spratly Islands. And China justifies those militarization as defensive measures in response to the other players' actions. And perhaps we will see further steps for militarization in response to this morning's arbitral tribunal's ruling. And there was a Japanese media report last week that China has been preparing countermeasures for the arbitration, including the legal measures such as the announcement of baselines in the Spratly Islands, and then the publication of the South China Sea White Paper to clarify Chinese claims, And also even the military measures such as the land reclamation of the Scarborough Shoal, the announcement of ADIZ, and the seizure of the second Thomas Shoal. And perhaps the militarization's goal is to establish a peacetime dominance in the South China Sea, because China understands in contingency, China cannot defeat militarily the United States yet. So China will continue to seek dominance in the South China Sea without crossing the military threshold by measures short of armed attack or gray zone coercion, such as the deployment of the Coast Guard cutters, fishing boats, maritime militia, and land reclamation, and ADIZ. And peacetime dominance is important for China in two ways. One is to implement its 9-line claim in the South China Sea, which was rejected by the arbitration today. And perhaps China will try to implement this 9-line claim as an exception to UNCLOS and other international law. For example, a Chinese expert at the Chinese Institute for Maritime Affairs, which is a part of the State Oceanic Administration, wrote that the South China Sea should be exempted from the EEZ regime because of the 9-line. So perhaps China will set unique rules in the South China Sea based on its domestic law rather than international law. And they will enforce those rules by its Coast Guard, maritime militia, and they are supported by the PLA Navy. And this will increase the frequency of the peacetime or gray zone coercion. And the other importance of the militarization has something to do with the Chinese military strategy. China needs to establish a peacetime dominance to restrict and prohibit ISR activities by other militaries, particularly the United States, as part of its A2AD or counter-intervention strategy. And by constructing forward military bases and facilities in the South China Sea, China can enhance its domain awareness, and also China can restrict US ISR activities. And more importantly, China seeks to make the South China Sea off limits to protect its strategic nuclear ballistic submarines, to establish a credible sea-based second strike capability. Just like the Soviet Union made the Barents Sea and the Sea of Okhotsk strategic bastions, China is doing the same in the South China Sea today. Even if China deploys its SSBN in the South China Sea, that will not change US overall deterrence postures immediately due to lack of China's SLBM range and also the China's command and control system. However, over the longer term, China's SSBN program might undermine the credibility of US nuclear forces unless the US and its regional allies and friends develop sufficient ISR and ASW capabilities. So what should be the future direction of the capacity building? Maritime capacity building is important in the South China Sea, for example, for HADR, or environmental protection and the counter-piracy. And the countries like Japan, US, Australia, South Korea, and even the United Kingdom have been working on it. But given China's militarization in the South China Sea, I think we have to shift the focus. And the focus should be first to counter the Chinese gray zone coercion, and the second, to enhance the ASW capabilities. With regard to the countering gray zone coercion, Japan faces the similar challenges in the East China Sea. And what Japan is doing in the East China Sea can be a model for the South China Sea. The keys to the stability in the East China Sea include the sufficient maritime domain awareness, effective law enforcement, seamless whole-of-government approach, particularly between Coast Guard and the Navy, and the close cooperation and the interoperability with the United States. Existing capacity building programs in the South China Sea focus on the provision of coastal radar system, Coast Guard cutters, aircraft training, and port and airport infrastructure development for maritime domain awareness and law enforcement. These efforts need to be continued and further developed, but there should be closer coordination among providing countries to stimulate seamless whole-of-government approach inside the recipient countries, and also the interoperability between the recipients and the providers. There has been some coordination between Japan and the United States and Australia on it, but those countries and any other potential providers should coordinate their capacity building programs in the South China Sea to generate synergy and also to avoid overlaps. Regarding the ASW, it is more important to establish a close cooperation between maritime powers, particularly US and Japan, and the coastal countries in the South China Sea, because ASW capabilities require decades to develop. So the US, Japan, and other maritime powers should coordinate and conduct ISR and ASW patrol in the South China Sea, while securing access to the recipient country's facilities in return for capacity building. Here, the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement between the US and the Philippines is a package deal of US access to Philippine bases and capacity building, and this can be a model. In addition, it is important for coastal states, particularly the Philippines, to develop counter A2AD capabilities along the first island chain to deal with Chinese militarization. Japan is now deploying anti-ship and anti-air missile mobile units along the Japanese southwestern island chain. If the Philippines deploy the similar units on its island chain, that would undermine Chinese efforts to dominate the South China Sea. So Japan, US, and other like-minded countries should provide such capabilities for the Philippines and other countries. And also, we should focus on the capacity building for Vietnam. Japan has provided 6 used patrol boats to Vietnam, but I have to admit there is still a political sensibility exists because of the different political regimes. But the recent Obama administration's decision to lift the arms embargo can push Japan and other regional countries. So in conclusion, we have to endorse the Philippines' effort for the peaceful resolution, and perhaps this capacity building and security cooperation between recipients and the providers can provide a good basis for supporting the Philippines' efforts. Thank you.
Thank you, Tetsuo-san. You've given us a lot to think about, and not a very cheerful assessment, I would say, from coming from my Japanese colleague. One thing that I think may be interesting to explore during the Q&A is, relatively nascent Japanese efforts to get involved in capacity building. Will the region automatically be in a receptive mode? Are there any barriers to the full realization of that potential? Is there any institutional deficiencies on the Japanese side regarding protecting technologies that are exported to third countries? These are regimes that the United States has built up over decades, and we're quite, one could say, overly bureaucratic, but I would say fairly sophisticated and fairly sober about how we export defense products and so forth. Japan has not had the benefit of the decades of experience, and perhaps will encounter some startup costs as they begin to undertake security cooperation and capacity building in the region. But maybe the audience has different things that these presentations have stoked interest in. So what I would ask as we enter Q&A, please do keep your questions concise. Please identify yourself, and then we'll get to it. Thank you. Okay, Bron.
Hi, I'm Chen Wei for China Daily. I'm quite kind of surprised. The panel seems to prescribe a recipe for more militarization. I mean, what do you call the capacity building in the South China Sea, which a lot of people worried is already too militarized. So why could we find more wisdom other than, make the South China Sea more militarized? And if I can ask one more for Tim, is that you cited a lot of Chinese capacity, sort of you feel worried. I mean, if the Chinese use the same logic, look at the U.S. capacity, which is overwhelmingly much more stronger. They should be even more scared. So, I don't know what's the logic behind when you listed all these Chinese capacities. Thank you.
Thank you for that question. So for the panel, does anyone want to take on whether more militarization is better overall? Please.
Thanks for your question. Just looking at it from the Indonesia case, as I mentioned earlier, it's a pity that Indonesia doesn't have a Coast Guard option to deploy in the case where there's been confrontation with Chinese fishermen around the Natuna Islands. So in Indonesia's case, it would be actually not a militarization, it would be actually the development of a civilian law enforcement capability first and foremost. But if you were to look at it in terms of its military upgrades, it's not an increased sense of military presence. It's not a militarization. It is actually just Indonesia implementing the minimum essential force it needs in order to defend its archipelago. So it is not some sort of acute increase in response to China. It is just the force that it needs in order to be able to perform its naval duties.
Yeah, I'll have a response. I think you're right that the U.S. capability is very robust, and the gap with China, while narrowing, is still considerable. I think the concern when I outlined the growing Chinese capabilities, not necessarily a comparison with China and U.S., so much as China and its neighbors in the South China Sea. To the extent that the Chinese military advantage grows, the more its decision makers feel like they have more options to manage a situation in peacetime and crisis or conflict, the more confident they feel. I think the risk grows that miscalculation could happen. And that's why I personally believe that building the capacity of other countries to raise the deterrent value, to induce caution, I don't see another way to try to restore stability.
I just want to make a point. I think we have to be a little bit more analytically specific, that militarization is imparting a military character to something. So you put Vietnamese naval infantry with sidearms on a weapon all the way through to the other end of the spectrum, making preparations for war and offense. And along the way, you have gray areas where Chinese airstrips can serve search and rescue and medical evacuation. They can also host bombers. So when you're looking, what I've described in the Philippines, there's no way even, yes, they're flown by men and women in uniform answering, but without the missiles and all that, they're securing things. In Vietnam's case, for example, they have offshore oil rigs, and they've got to protect that. It's defensive. What's the ability to project that power beyond their own exclusive economic zones or protecting the features that they occupy? Again, and their deterrence, and I thought we heard that strength, rather weakness, invites problems. And when you deploy an HD 981 rig in Vietnam with 80 up to 100 ships with a core of PLAN, and then Coast Guard, and then fishing fleets and tugboats, because they can smash into you, you're finding a Vietnamese reaction by building up its own Coast Guard, which I didn't discuss. But the weapons itself, we have coastal artillery. Who are they threatening? Anybody that decides to come within 200 nautical miles of Vietnam with hostile intent. So is it militarization along the spectrum, and it doesn't look like making preparations for war. And then it's in that beyond the gray area of having the equipment to be able to defend.
Yeah. Thank you. Okay, next, please. Sir.
Bill Jones from Executive Intelligence Review. Colonel Walton mentioned at the beginning an interesting point of creating a new security architecture in which China ultimately would be a part of. Now, President Xi talked about a new security architecture in Asia at the CICA meeting last year, which was not so specific. Maybe he had a different idea of it. It would be all comprehensive in the Asian countries, and I don't know if he considered the U.S. to be a part of it. But it seems to me that given the fact that China has invited the U.S. to be a part of the Belt and Road and a part of the AIIB, that there would also be consideration for a security architecture with China and with the United States involved in it. However, the way you're approaching this, and I know that Ash Carter said that they wanted a principled security architecture and probably even indicated that China might be a part of that as well, but the way you're dealing with it is building on the old Cold War alliances, similar to what one did with Russia in the 1990s. It was going to be a Europe, whole and free, and we kept NATO, and we said to Russia, you can be a part of it, kind of, in this NATO-Russia alliance. We saw where that's gone to. Now, so that if you try and build a new security architecture, you really have to bring all the countries on board in their own common interest and talk about how this will be built. I can't see an issue of China joining a coalition that partially is aimed against them, and of course they would also want, and I think everybody else would want, Russia involved in it. It is a Pacific power as much as the United States, and they would have to be a part of this architecture. But it seems to me that this is the ultimate solution of avoiding war and conflict or new Cold War, to have a new security architecture in the Pacific. So if you have any comments on that, because you mentioned the
I think you can take confidence in the capability of the diplomatic prowess of a new Trump administration to solve that very complex problem. So, but thank you for that point, well noted. Questions? Yes, please, in the green.
I'm Jennifer Turner. I'm a student. For example, carrier ports in Singapore. So what impact do you think these overlapping relationships will have for capacity building and any future potential escalation?
I can take a stab at that. I mean, look, I think right now, from my own experience, again, I just retired a year ago. My last position was as a defense attaché in Thailand, a country, an ally of the United States, but one that does have a very sophisticated defense relationship and growing defense relationship with China. The two are not mutually exclusive at all. I think certain accommodations have to be made. I think that, for example, a point that I brought up earlier about the safeguarding technology would certainly become an issue for the United States to transfer technology to a country with a very intimate relationship with China. That would certainly give us pause. But apart from that, I think there are kind of operational ways that that a country like Singapore, like any other military in Southeast Asia that seeks good relationships with the United States and China, they can find out the operational way to get that done. Okay, let's move on to the next, please. Okay, ma'am, in the orange.
Thank you very much. My name is Rita Herona Adkins. I am a freelance journalist. If I may ask this question, the new Philippine administration has sort of stated that it would pursue a bilateral effort or dialogue with China regarding resolving the Chinese, the South China Sea or the West Philippine Sea for the purpose of obtaining economic assistance. My question is, what would be the implication of this or the impact at the regional level so far as multilateral and regional attempts at resolving China Sea issues are related?
Well, as has been pointed out by the 2-year hiatus of relations between the Philippines and China, particularly on these kinds of issues, Philippines would join the rest of the region. Everybody else is working with China and doing their other things at the same time. They're not incompatible. Even if that now, the way I would be very cynical, not humorous. Hello, Philippines. Congratulations, President Duterte. The arbitral tribunal has now given you, as a nationalist and defender of national sovereignty, more possessions that you now have to defend, very much so. So his discussions with China are going to be different from the ones he was proposing, because he goes in with very strong legal and moral backing from that decision and the international tribunal. So he can protect sovereignty, and China can, they work out joint fishing in the Scarborough Shoal. The alliance with the U.S. can work, and that can be modulated so as not to interrupt that particular process. And hello, the most armed country that's working to defend its sovereignty Vietnam has just had their 9th steering committee with China to do massive development across a whole number of areas that they've been doing for a long time. So it's getting the Philippines out from the cold and getting them to be part of what the rest of the region is doing anyway. And finally, I just really have to take a shot when people talk about Cold War alliances. The Australian alliance with the US and New Zealand was aimed at stopping Japanese militarism. Alliances change over time, and now we're engaged in humanitarian assistance, disaster relief, and a whole host of other things. So that webs and spokes thing it's transformed and it's different. And there are 3 overlapping kind of architectures in the region. There's Chinese-centric, which wants to keep the US out. There's the US theater of engagement, where the US wants to lead. And there's ASEAN's attempt to be central. And instead of inventing new things that exclude others, it's to try to make the ASEAN Defense Ministers Meeting Plus more effective, make the East Asia Summit a leaders-led meeting, give direction, and sometimes when you put my little Lego, to finally get connections across the board so one reports to the other and you can get work down, and the synergies that they're allowing between the ARF intersessional meetings and the expert working groups is one start. So there's plenty of architecture out there. We don't need to, it includes from the East Asia Summit, the ADMM plus China anyway.
Thank you, Carl. So does anyone have a question related to the great presentation that we had about the Jokowi Maritime Fulcrum strategy? Or in the back, Bron, please.
I just wanted to ask a question about, I'm Bronson Percival, I'm with CNA. Mostly for Natalie, but for others too. You're seeing a real change in Indonesia and Malaysia in terms of how they're reacting. The consensus is breaking up, and you're seeing the militaries thinking more and more about the South China Sea. What kind of Chinese actions do you think, or what would you predict would be, if you spun out scenarios where these countries' policies start to come back together, where they might accelerate their capacity building, that kind of thing? In other words, is 2024 totally out of mind?
So again, Bron, you're asking what may drive more convergence between Malaysia and Indonesia?
No, what may drive more convergence in Malaysian and Indonesian policies on the South China Sea?
Okay.
I think one of the challenges at the moment, I think actually one of the factors that would drive greater convergence is actually just the president himself. And that might seem rather trite, but in particular, over the last 2 years, you see competing nodes of strategic policy making, where you get anyone from the defense minister to the coordinating minister of political legal affairs, rather than coordinating, actually making policy himself. So I think that's one problematic thing, that the president himself needs to set the agenda, stick to that agenda, and we've seen some positive steps from that with him convening the cabinet meeting aboard the warship, the Iman Bonjol, the other day, but framing the issue of confrontation with China more in economic terms. So I would definitely like to see that happen. Other than that, I'm not particularly sure. It would have to be some significant escalation of violence, because at the moment, the confrontations, the 3 that have occurred this year, have been rather limited, and so there hasn't been that deep sense of crisis, in the wake of the latest one. Jokowi announced an increase in the budget, which is a relatively modest, response, and asked for capability upgrades. But I think it would have to take either, the death of an Indonesian sailor or something more significant for there to be a much more acute response. But ultimately, capability plans take time. Modernization occurs over the period of months and years. So I don't think that there's anything they could do other than reposition forces in the area, which is what they're doing already.
Thank you.
Hi, Julia Xue, Senior Fellow of Chatham House and Law Professor, Shanghai Jiao Tong University. I was very concerned in the morning about the legal and political consequences of the war, but after this panel, I'm very concerned about the military modernization and capacity building in the region. And so I'm just thinking, given the fact that they try to avoid this extreme kind of scenario, but in case, I mean, the ocean, very vast ocean environment, even the commander or the Navy boys, they want to try their new toys with so much money there and invest. I mean, what would be the, how real the situation, I mean, given if out of control, and at what scale? And even for the worst case, should we, like people based in Shanghai, start to consider to migrate to Canada for some safer place? And or what will be the final agenda for this kind of military capacity building up? What about if China going along that line and escalate its capacity building? So is there somewhere we can stop there and then to really to use this to maintain the regional peace? I really just don't understand the logic behind that. Thank you very much.
I share some of your, I definitely share your concern that militarization, to the China Daily Reporter's comment, is a concern. It's unsettling to see the amount of firepower that's being built up. There is a bit of a security dilemma dynamic that's building here as China builds up its capability to try and protect what it regards as its legitimate interests, and to make up for decades where it did not invest highly in its defense capability. This is fueling a reaction by other countries who want to defend their own interests, and they're building their military forces as well. I do think there is some cause for hope. I think the Chinese efforts to build capabilities that could be used for HADR and collaboration on non-traditional threats is a helpful step. There is interest in the part of many countries on collaborating and working with the U.S. and with China to address shared threats, and so that's good, and that sort of military cooperation, I think, should be encouraged on a multilateral and on a bilateral level. But at the end of the day, it's difficult for me as an analyst to recommend an alternative other than for countries to cautiously invest in defending and building capabilities to defend their interests, because this deterrence is traditionally what induces caution and encourages all players to move very carefully and cautiously and not make rash decisions that could lead to unintended escalation.
Thank you, Tim. Thank you. I have a question for Natalie to follow up on her excellent presentation, then one for Carl. The latest showdown between the Indonesian Coast Guard and the Chinese fishing fleet or fishing boat. The one thing that was not clear to me in trying to follow this is how this was portrayed and greeted Indonesia by public opinion. Were Indonesians thrilled that the Coast Guard was out there enforcing their maritime claims? And then did the government pat itself on the back or kind of downplay it? And for Carl, I guess the observation is, looking at your discussion of Vietnam and Philippines and what have you, the Vietnamese are the only ones who are putting their money where their mouth is in terms of military capability. You know, the Philippines have decades to go before they're going to be able to do anything on their own. And so the question I have is, the Vietnamese have been pushed around in 1974 and then in 1988 by the PLA. And given what the money that they're putting into this, it suggests to me anyway that Vietnam has said never again. So the question to you is, if China tried to use force to run the Vietnamese off of their Spratly holdings, would the Vietnamese fight back?
Thank you for your question. With regards to the first part about how the latest confrontation between, it was the Indonesian Navy, by the way, which fired warning shots, yes, against the Chinese fishing vessel, was greeted in the media. The issue has been phrased as one of eradicating illegal fishing and securing Indonesia's natural resources. So from that perspective, of course, the Indonesian people are very much behind this, and that is reflected in public polling, which has provided high levels of support for the Maritime Minister, Susi Pujiastuti, who has this very bombastic policy of blowing up boats. So from that perspective, when framed as economic potential more than just guarding sovereignty. It has multiple levels of appeal to the Indonesian people. And as I mentioned to Bron just now, Jokowi convened this meeting aboard the warship around the Natuna Islands just shortly thereafter for the purposes of discussing economic potential. Why you want the military chief there with you is, beyond me, but of course they're discussing more than economic potential. But that's some of the way that these policies have become a little bit more palatable. I've just missed the second half of, was there a second half of your question as well? Okay, great.
Yeah, I have a problem with answering the question. It depends on the scenario, the warning time, the deterioration of relations to determine the Vietnamese response, because the Communist Party in power, if it doesn't defend Vietnamese sovereignty, is facing a population that's white hot against China. So if they don't stand up and defend that sovereignty, for me, I cannot, in the present context, see China seizing one of the 21. It's never taken a feature that someone else has occupied. 74 was against South Vietnam. 1988 was a clash at sea and on a reef. They would resist, they would struggle, as they would say. The last thing they'd want to do is get into a conventional theater engagement with China. So they're building up their own counter-intervention asymmetric capacities to be able to inflict damage. 21 features in themselves are so tiny. When you hear from our Chinese colleague that the Vietnamese have done land reclamation, yeah, well, how many 500 football fields? Well, I've refereed soccer. Probably Vietnam has got, the goal area is among the 500 fields that are out there. So until I know the scenario and the warning time and what led to the deterioration of relations, because Vietnam would use party-to-party ties to get on the hotlines that they're establishing. And in fact, I'll just end on that. Since HC 981, a major delegation went to Vietnam, led by its 13 generals and the defense minister, and they're constantly having meetings on the border. And the way I read it, and I'm an Army brat, is you got the defense ministers and you got all the commanders in land, sea, and air from China and Vietnam that could most conflict with each other, and you're telling them not to. You're telling them to behave and cool it and develop the procedures so you don't let an incident escalate. And they keep having these meetings on the borders, and it finally struck me why. Because the population in both countries hate each other, the young people, and these are showing joint patrols to deal with transnational crimes, that the Chinese military and the Vietnamese military can do these joint patrols. And I think part of it's directed inwards, because it's hard to do something with China and Vietnam and get the population approval in the reverse. But here they meet on the borders, the defense ministers, they also go elsewhere. And I'll just end on that. So what I'm getting at is that scenario is the least probable, but I'd have to know the conditions, because Vietnam would resist if it's existential. I think, yeah.
Thank you. So we are almost out of time. I need very concise. I'll take two very concise questions to finish with. Excuse me, let me get this gentleman in the back. Yes.
Good afternoon. My name is Mr. Solis from University of Maryland. I only have two simple questions. One is, what would China feel now that all the major players, like say the UK, the US, France, the UK and Australia and Japan, and India as well, are in favor of the Philippines versus alone by itself? And number two, what are we gonna do with the islands that the China have built over time in those areas of conflicts of interest? Are we gonna dismantle that, or gonna give it to other claimant countries, or give it back to whoever, or make it as a neutral ground? Thank you.
My colleague,
Well, I think Chinese leadership is very much concerned about the current situation. But at the same time, the problem is Chinese domestic factor does not allow the Chinese leadership to modify its external behavior. So that's the perhaps the basic problem we face. So of course, we have to continue to stick to the universal principles, and we have to always keep a room for cooperation with China. But unless China changes its behavior itself, it's very difficult to cooperate with China at this moment. And I couldn't catch the second question.
I'm sorry, we are out of time, and I want to thank you for your kind attention. Please join me in thanking the panelists.